Douglas Skelton, writer of many novels, some very fascinating non-fiction novels about crime, and then a whole series of very fine crime fiction books. So do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit to everyone and just explain your work?
My name is Douglas Skelton. I'm an alcoholic. Yeah, as you say, I've written a number of books. I started off as a journalist and then moved into true crime and eventually moved into fiction. I have investigated real life crime. I did work for Glasgow solicitors for a number of years, ostensibly what they call a precognition officer. But really, with the solicitors that I was working for, it meant more than that. A precognition officer, in case people don't realise, in Scotland was somebody who went out and just took statements from people who might be witnesses in a criminal case. At that time, the prosecution were not required to hand over everything that they had in a particular case. All they would give the defence was a list of witnesses that they might call. So then somebody like me had to go out and interview them and ask them, what might you say in court if you happen to be called? And the witness was under no obligation to tell the truth. So they could say anything that they like and there was no comeback for them. But the solicitors that I worked for would go further than that. So there would be investigation work. So I was out in the streets of Glasgow's East End in the middle of the night, banging in doors, looking through hours and hours of CCTV footage for various cases, trying to find witnesses, talking to people, and then finding witnesses who weren't on the prosecution lists. So it was interesting, and a lot of what I learned in that found its way into the fiction in a lot of ways. So everything that I learned during those years has informed just about every part of the fiction that I've written.
Mm-hmm. So I was quite interested by one of your earlier non-fiction books to start with, on Indian Peter, which is a story of someone who is kidnapped and sort of sold as an indentured servant, a la David Balfour, to the Carolinas, and then eventually makes it back. So you can start seeing the Stevenson's influences coming through in your writing.
Oh yeah, I mean, Peter, I've no doubt that Stevenson would have been aware of the story of Peter Williamson, who was taken from Aberdeen as a teenager, as you say, and then sold into indentured servitude in the colonies. And his story is absolutely fascinating. In fact, he was shipwrecked as well, not in Scotland, but off the coast of America. And then eventually made his way to the mainland with the rest of the survivors. So there are strong parallels there, but Peter Williamson's story goes even further, because he comes back and wages this 20-year legal battle with the rich men of Aberdeen who were behind that particular trade in kidnapped people and legitimately indentured servants, to get them to own up, and eventually won. But the story behind that is incredible. The jiggery pokery that was going on in the legal profession, and getting the man who was going to judge on the case drunk in order to find their way is absolutely fascinating. But Peter Williamson, we're not terribly sure how much of what he said happened to him in America is true. I think there's an element of truth to the fact that he was captured by Native Americans and spent some time with them, and then escaped from them. He was certainly at the siege of Oswego, because the 7 Years' War, what they called over there the French and Indian War, was then raging. He was at a fort called Oswego. He was certainly there because there's documents to back that up. And he was certainly exchanged in a prisoner of war exchange, and found himself back in dear old Blighty, because all of that's provable in documentation. And then what happened in Scotland is also backed up by documents. So it is a fascinating story, and it's a book I'm particularly proud of.
I mean, there's a lot of Scots who are unaware that indentured servants and kidnapping, they were almost slaves, weren't they? And that it was a bit of a thing. If you fell in hard times or somebody didn't like you, you could end up suffering the same fate as David Balfour almost suffered.
Yeah, it does seem to have been a bit of a crime wave up in the Highlands when they would roam around and just troll for people that they could take and then get them drunk or lure them somehow with sex workers and get them to sign on the dotted line. But Peter Williamson was just a teenager, and they denied that they had him. So it's very, very interesting, and it's as you say, it's a factor of history that I certainly didn't know anything about until I started looking into it.
And then, of course, you went on to write, well, it's two particular series of crime novels. The first series is very much the sort of set in the sort of Glasgow hardman genre. Do you want to explain a little bit about that series before we go on to your latest series? Yeah,
when I moved into fiction, I'd written 11, I think it was 11 true crime or Scottish criminal history books or something like Indian Peter, which is steeped in crime as well. When I moved into fiction, I thought, what can I do? So the natural way is you write about the police, but there's an author you might not have heard of called Ian Rankin, who was doing it very, very well, and Val McDermid was doing it, and other authors were doing it. And I thought, well, I can't add anything to that, and I certainly can't do better than them. So I went the other way. I went with the criminals, and that's because of the work that I'd done in the investigative side, but also because I had my second non-fiction book, co-written with Lisa Brownlee, was an examination of a miscarriage of justice. You can see there's a theme developing here. It was the Ice Cream Wars case in Glasgow, if anybody knows what that is, but it was a quite horrendous crime in which 6 members of one family died in a house fire, which turned out to be what we call in Scotland willful fire raising. And 2 men were convicted, but they consistently proclaimed their innocence. Now, we came along around about 10 years later, just under 10 years after that, and started to look into it, and it wrote a book. And another 10 years passed before the 2 men were cleared on appeal. So again, everything I learned doing that and everything in the investigative work came into particularly the Davy McCall books. Because I learned a lot about Glasgow's underworld. I learned a lot about the way that the underworld talks, the way that they think and what they do. They are still thrillers. They're not documentaries. So they are still thrillers. But the 4 Davy McCall books, I still like them. I do enjoy them. They're very, very gritty, very, very violent. And after that, I thought, well, what can I do now? I've already done that. What can I do that's different? So I lightened things up. And I had 3 rules when I started to write fiction. One was that I would never have a character with a strange name. So the next 2 books featured a sort of private eye in Glasgow called Dominic Quest with an E at the end.
That's bad for copy editors and editors.
Yeah. Well, he always has to explain how to spell it throughout the books. Now, these were a lot lighter, and because the Davy McCall books were very much grounded in reality, still thrillers, but grounded in reality. With the next 2, I thought, no, I want to fly away a bit here. So if I'm going to have a gun battle, if I went to have a gun battle in the middle of Alexandra Park in Glasgow's East End, I might not have done that with Davy McCall, but I did it with Dominic Quest because it was that kind of story. So the second rule that I had was that I would never write a serial killer book because I don't particularly enjoy them myself. So the second book in the Dominic Quest series was a serial killer book. And my third rule was that rules 1 and 2 don't necessarily apply. So I managed to stick to one of the rules that I'd set myself. So I was quite proud of that. I did 2 Dominic Quest books and 1 short story. It's 2 short stories actually. And the next one, I like to challenge myself. So the next thing I thought I would try and do is, can I write a book that doesn't have any Scottish people and that isn't actually set in Scotland? And can I write it so that it's very much like the 70s and 80s conspiracy thriller movies that I really enjoy, these chase movies. So the Janus Run was born, which is set in New York. Sold hardly any copies. So that kind of died a death, I'm afraid. But again, I'm still proud of it. There's maybe bits that I thought, well, I've gone a wee bit wrong there, but I'm still proud of it. And then I came to Rebecca Connolly.
And that's a big change, isn't it, Rebecca Connolly? Because you're sort of moving out of Glasgow to the Highlands. She's based in Inverness. She's a woman.
Yep. And I'm not.
No.
I hope you've all noticed that.
And
she's also in her mid-20s, which I'm not. I'm 5 or 10 years older than that. And so that was the next challenge. Could I do this? Could I write convincingly? I'd have my protagonist, a 20-something woman. And so we've got 3 books out in that. The first one was Thunder Bay. And then there was The Blood is Still. Thunder Bay. For Thunder Bay, I invented an island off the west coast of Scotland because we can do that. The Blood is Still is set in and around Inverness and begins in Culloden. And A Rattle of Bones, which is the one that has the James of the Glen connection.
Mm-hmm. And so we were discussing this the other day there, but one of the interesting things about Stevenson is he does a lot of the historical work for his books and for Kidnapped. He does a lot of the research, but then when he starts writing, he just races, it's just pure stream of consciousness. But he does a little bit of different things with fiction, or to flag up that it's fiction, the route that they take isn't entirely true. He spells the name of Alan Breck Stewart differently with one L or 2 L's to show that his Alan is fictional. And he doesn't even get the date right, 1751. Is it a mistake? Does he care? It doesn't matter, So he does things that just flag up that Alan Breck is slightly different in stature to the real man. So he does that. And we were discussing this the other day because all of us as field archaeologists, I'm sure we've all tried to write a fiction book, but most of us probably get stuck in a bit of history and then go down this huge sort of rabbit hole of research and never come out the other side. So how, as a writer, do you keep the historical stuff light, if you know what I mean?
Keep it in the background. You just have to remember that that's not the story that you're telling, and you always have to keep in mind what is the spine of my story. And in my case, the spine is what's happening in the present day, with Rebecca investigating a possible miscarriage of justice, which bears echoes to what happened back in the 18th century.
And you kind of, for Thunder Bay, you say you invent a whole island, which helps you play around with, without being troubled by facts. And do you want to tell everyone about your mountain?
Yeah, people ask me. The island that I invented was Sturm. And people say it's based on Mull, isn't it? And I said, no, it's not based on Mull. It's got bits of Mull, it's got bits of Skye, it's got bits of Arran, it's got bits of Gia, where my maternal grandmother came from. And it's just an amalgam. So I would just say, well, I want that bit, I want that bit, I want that bit of mythology, I want that bit of history. And it talks about the clearances as well. So that's all lumped in there. But I also wanted a mountain on this island. And I could have taken Benmore from Mull, but my favourite mountain is Schiehallion in Perthshire, and I've been in that area so many times. I used to go with it, 2 or 3 times a year on holiday, and so I thought, well, I'm going to have Schiehallion So I lifted Schiehallion basically from Perthshire and I put it onto my island. I didn't call it Schiehallion, but I gave it the same mythology about witches living there and being the hill of the fairies, and the She, etc. So now I have a problem, because the book that I'm writing just now, the Rebecca book, which is coming out next year, there's one coming out this July, but I'm writing next year's now, is set in Ranach. And of course, I've already used Schiehallion on for Thunder Bay. So I've got a bit of a problem there. But I think what I'm just going to do is ignore it. Just say, no, Schiehalion's there, that's what it is. And I'll have Rebecca say, well, that's very like the mountain on Sturm.
Hard to...
What a coincidence.
So do you want to hold up your latest Rebecca Connolly novel, which is partially inspired?
I just happen to have a copy.
You just happen to have one you made earlier. There you go.
That's A Rattle of Bones. That's the one that features James of the Glen. And it begins.
It's got a fantastic opening scene. Do you want to describe a little bit about the opening scene in Rattle of Bones?
Yeah, the opening scene is actually 17, talking about getting the dates wrong.
A few years after.
1755. And it's on the hill. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of the hill.
Did you notice that I said Hill of the Narrows?
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll get Neil to do it later.
So it's there. I wouldn't even attempt, which is shocking. But it begins there, 1755, and it's basically the eve of when they were going to take down whatever was left of James Stewart. And there's a solitary government soldier there standing guard, and he's a bit spooked. He's been there all night, and he's there as a punishment. And the skeleton keeps rattling, and that spooks him even further. But at one point, so he's not looking at it, he purposely looks away, and the dawn is breaking and the light's starting to come up. But when he looks back, there's an old woman standing at the foot of the gibbet, and she turns out to be some sort of relative of James of the Glens, and she kind of harangues him about the injustice of it all. And at one point, the breeze stirs the bones again, and he steps back, and she says, that scares you. And then she says, well, that's the sound that you will hear whenever there's injustice, whenever there's a miscarriage through the years, you will hear that sound, basically. And that's where the title comes from, A Rattle of Bones. And through the rest of the book, there is a motif that Rebecca picks up, and she hears things rattling at some points. There's generally a natural explanation for it, but at the end, I'm not going to spoil anything, but at the end there is a kind of coda with the wind coming that says perhaps it wasn't so natural after all.
Mm-hmm. And in Rattle of Bones, it revolves around a modern day James Stewart, who is in prison for a miscarriage of justice. And I find it quite interesting because in Robert Louis Stevenson, and indeed in real life, in a way, the real life James Stewart of Glendura, things are done against him and Jacobites after Culloden because they're Highlanders, they're Gaelic speakers. And your James Stewart is also the other. He's of mixed race. He's gay. Was that deliberate?
I'm going to say yes, because it makes me sound as if I'm really good. No, that was accidental. It really was. It was just something that I wanted to bring in different aspects of it. But now that you've said that, I'm going to claim that.
Fair enough. I think we said earlier, didn't we, that readers just go off in directions that you don't. You just... No.
I mean, the thing about writing is that you quite often do things without knowing why, and perhaps there was something there in the back of my mind. I mean, I'm a firm believer. We talk about writer's block, and we talk about whether you plan a novel or whether you just fly by the seat of your pants. I tend towards the latter, but I do believe that somewhere in the back of my mind, but my mind has planned the book ahead of time. It just hasn't told me, because I will write something, probably, maybe 6 or 7 weeks into writing, and I'll suddenly do something, and then I'll say, oh, that's why I wrote that on page 45. So I really believe that there's something in the back of a writer's mind that's already got it worked out, just hasn't told me or my fingers yet.
Mm-hmm. And so the plot of the novel, Rebecca Connolly, she's a reporter based in Inverness, but with Glasgow connections. And she's sort of helping to investigate this sort of modern miscarriage of justice. This young man who's been in prison for many years for murdering his gay lover, isn't it?
Yes.
Murdo. And very bloody murder.
It's I mean, the murder's not particularly described, but it was a brutal murder, and it's got a political element because the victim was a former lawyer, or was a lawyer, but was steeped in politics. Was a kind of spin doctor in a lot of ways, so there's various other suggestions of what it could have been behind it. Don't want to say too much because, spoiler alert. There are prison diaries in it, and again, don't want to say too much about them because it's a major spoiler there. Mm-hmm. So it's all very simple but complex.
Yeah, and of course the murder takes place in Appin, doesn't it? So,
yes.
So part of the scenes mm-hmm. of the novel take place in and around Appin.
Yeah,
but some imaginary bits of Appin as well.
Yeah, I made up a house for the murder. I made up a village. I made up a bay, I think, as well. So there was a lot made up for that. But again, it's just so that I can control the topography. I can control the history. I wanted to have this place where there was an old chapel, and the legend is that the Highlanders thundered across the bay on their horses. So all of that was put in. So again, it's just control. Writers are control freaks about the work. We just need to keep control of everything that's going on.
Yeah. I kind of, when I was reading it, I mean, Neil lives in Appin, born and bred, but when I was reading the novel, I had the map out and I thought, I don't really think this thing.
It's not there at all. It bears absolutely no resemblance to anywhere real.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I kind of wondered about, that you sort of shot me down in flames, was that in the Dead Activists, I kind of wondered if you were referencing the Willie McRae case, which is another famous sort of possible state murder that took place.
Obviously, I know about it. I've written about it. I've researched that. Yes, I mean, I can't lie. Obviously, it was there in my mind when I was doing it. The suggestion that the security services were tapping his phone, were following him. That was all part of the Willie McRae story. Mm-hmm. But that's about that, and some aspects of they say of his private life, or the inferences about his private life kind of filtered into it as well. So obviously that is there, but I'm careful not to say, take any political stance with it, because that's not what the story's about.
So I think I have to ask you, as crime writer, as investigator, professional investigator, who do you think murdered James Stewart of Glendur, or James of the Glen?
Yeah, I do tend towards Alan Breck, Stuart.
He's a Campbell, Neil. He's a Campbell.
Well, I think he's probably the man most likely to. And whether or not it was something that was planned, or it was just a crime of circumstance. Mm-hmm. Oh, there we are. I'll just take this pot shot now. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But again, I'm a writer, so I love a conspiracy theory. I like this whole idea. about the 4 young men who'd set out to kill, and it didn't happen in Cameron country, but saw their chance over here on the Stuart lands. So who knows?
Who knows? So what's next for you in terms of writing? What are you currently doing?
Well, the next Rebecca, Where Demons Hide, comes out in July. That's set between Stirring Again and Inverness. And I've got another series starting later in the year, which is an historical series. It's set in 1715. Can't say a lot about that, but the official announcement's coming out at the end of January. And as I said, I'm currently writing the fifth Rebecca book, which is set in Ranach at the moment, unless I decide to completely fictionalise it and come up with my own valley.
Oh, busy man.
Yes. It's all good.
And all your books, I think we should say, you can find them in all good bookshops.
Yes, and a few bad ones.
Yeah, and Kindle.
Yep. On Kindle, audiobook as well.
Are they an Audible? Brilliant.
Well, the Rebecca books, are an audio.
Who reads them for you?
It's Sarah Barron.
Oh, okay.
And she's really good.
Yeah.
I don't like reading or listening to my own stuff after I've written it, because I always think, I could have done that better. But I do listen to a bit of it, and it was Thunder Bay I started to listen to. And I thought, that's really good. Did I actually write that? So I thought she'd rewritten it as she was reading it, but no, thankfully she hadn't.
Excellent. Well, listen, we're really grateful for you to come to speak to us in this.
Thanks for having me.
The start of Scotland's Year of Stories 2022. So I think ACFA and GAS and all the tour guides, we've kind of kicked it off. So thank you, Douglas.
Thanks for having me.